In this video, we will talk about the formation of the Torah and the documentary hypothesis. We will begin by discussing why the documentary hypothesis was thought up, who did this, and what the documentary hypothesis is, particularly dating the sources in the Torah. We will conclude by applying the documentary hypothesis to some texts in Genesis. The documentary hypothesis arose around the 17th century. Confessional scholars like Thomas Hobbes, Baruch Spinoza, and Richard Simon noticed that there were problems with the idea of Mosaic authorship, or the fact that Moses supposedly authored the Torah. There were few things that Moses could not have known during his lifetime and written down. The first of these was his death. This is explained in the end of Deuteronomy, and these scholars realized that no man could write about his own death. You obviously have the idea that Moses could have prophesied or predicted his death, but this is one of the things that, again, these confessional scholars pointed out as a problem with Mosaic authorship. The second issue is in Deuteronomy 1:1, which says, "These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan, in the wilderness, on the plain opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel, Laban, Hazeroth, and Di-Zahab." These mentions that we have in Deuteronomy 1:1 indicate things that Moses would not have known during his lifetime. These are other things that these confessional scholars and others pointed to, saying that Moses could not have known and therefore could not have written these texts. Finally, these scholars pointed to simply the fact that the Torah is written in third person. If Moses had written the text, these scholars asked, why did he not write in first person, saying, "I, Moses, encountered God in a burning bush," or "I, Moses, led the Israelites towards the promised land"? Instead, the text is written in third person. It talks about Moses saying, "Moses did these things. Moses encountered God." Obviously, this is a simplistic reason, but along with the other two, is an indicator that Moses probably did not write the Torah, as many people traditionally think. The claim of Mosaic authorship is not actually in the Torah, but comes from some verses that say that Moses wrote down these words. But these can be understood referring to the 10 Commandments that were given from God, rather than the Torah as a whole. These scholars did not just reject the Mosaic authorship of the Torah, but also rejected the idea that one singular author wrote the Torah. In their research, they found that there were multiple authors throughout the entire Torah, even within books like Genesis and Exodus. Some of the things that they pointed to for this were inconsistencies. First off, they noticed that various names were used for God, but were not consistent in when and why they were used. In some cases, you'll see Elohim, which we translate to God, or Yahweh, which we translate to Lord. These were not necessarily used interchangeably, but were used by possibly different authors throughout the text. This would be like someone referring to a girl named Jane Doe by Miss Doe at some points, and at other points as Jane, but not having a clear reason for why they are changing back and forth. Some other things that these scholars noticed were inconsistencies in ages. For example, in the story of Abraham and his father Terah, it says that Terah had lived 70 years when he became the father of Abram, and when he was 205 years old, he died in Haran. Later in Genesis, it says that the Lord said to Abram to go from his country and from his father's house to the land that he will show you, and that Abram was 75 when he departed from Haran. These inconsistencies with age, which you can see in Genesis 11 and 12, are other things that these scholars pointed to say there are inconsistencies in the text that indicate not just one singular author could have written it. Another thing that these scholars saw were repetitions in the text. Some of these events we see are the flood story and creation stories. The flood is repeated several times within the chapters of 6 through 9 in slightly different ways. The creation story is given twice in slightly different ways in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. In Exodus, Moses goes up the mountain 3 times to talk to God and receive the commandments. These are repetitions with some slight differences, but are recapping the same event over and over. This is another one of the reasons why these scholars pointed to the text having multiple authors, rather than just one singular author. Finally, the scholars pointed to stylistic differences in the text. These are not as obvious in English, but in Hebrew, they're much more so. Some of these inconsistencies can be as simple as narrative prose versus poetic structures. As we see in the first chapter of Genesis, it flows much more like a poem, whereas the second and third chapters tell more of a prose-like story that depicts the first humans living on Earth. What we call the documentary hypothesis was theorized by Julius Wellhausen around the mid-19th century. Wellhausen, a German confessional Christian scholar, looked at the Bible and noticed these inconsistencies, repetitions, and differences in style, and recognized that the Bible was, first off, not objective history, that the author's beliefs played a role, and that multiple authors must have written the text in the Torah. He noticed, when breaking down the text, 4 different sources, which we'll talk about here in a moment. He found these by breaking up the text. Simply, he went through the text of Genesis through Deuteronomy and noticed some of these inconsistencies, these repetitions, and these stylistic differences, and cut out the text figuratively to the point where he could notice different styles. After breaking up the text, he reconstructed the sources. For this step, he would take the parts that seemed to go together stylistically or chronologically and put them in the same piles, metaphorically speaking. Finally, he dated the sources. In dating the sources, he looked at what kind of characteristics or what kind of important events or concerns were part of the text in each source. This led Wellhausen to come up with the documentary hypothesis. A definition for the documentary hypothesis is an explanation for the inconsistencies, repetitions, and stylistic differences in the Torah that claims that the Torah was compiled from independent, parallel, and complete narratives. There are a few key terms to note here. First off, this is a hypothesis. We do not have any of these sources outside of what we have in the Hebrew Bible. Many scholars, and not necessarily non-confessional scholars only, as Wellhausen and others have been confessional scholars looking at the text, have come up with this idea based on what they find in the text. But again, this is a hypothesis and is conjecture, not fact. Overall, this is generally accepted by most Hebrew Bible scholars, though some will disagree on how many sources are in the Torah. We also want to look at the terms independent. These sources are stories that did not have knowledge of one another when they were compiled. They were written by separate people with stories that were passed down over time and are parallel in the sense that they tell overall the same story. There might be some minor differences, again like we see with Abram and Terah, with the year changes, but for the most part, these narratives tell the same story. And finally, they were complete narratives. Whether we have them in their complete form in the Torah, at one point, these sources seem to have told a complete story from the time of creation through the death of Moses. For the most part, there are 4 sources that we want to look at when we talk about the documentary hypothesis. Again, some scholars disagree on how many sources were used in compiling the Torah. Some go with fewer than 4, some with more than 4. But generally, scholars agree upon these 4 sources. As you saw in the previous slide, we abbreviate these as J, E, D, and P, which you can see in this top column here. Each one stands for what the source is called. The priestly source we abbreviate as P, the Deuteronomist source we abbreviate as D, the Elohist source we abbreviate as E, and the Yahweh source we abbreviate as J, because Yahwist and Yahweh are frequently spelled with a J instead of a Y when they're transliterated from Hebrew. This chart is going to show you several different characteristics of the sources. First, we want to look at the location of the sources. Each source seems to have a different stress on particularly where it was written and what the focus is on who the audience is. The J source seems to have a stress on Judah, the southern kingdom, and was probably written in the southern kingdom of Judah. The Elohist source, on the other hand, stresses the northern kingdom of Israel. The Deuteronomist source does not stress either Judah or Israel particularly, but stresses the central shrine that we see in the city of Jerusalem. The priestly source also stresses the southern kingdom of Judah. The Yahweh source stresses leadership, kings, priests, prophets, and so on. The leadership is particularly important to the source as it's probably written during the monarchy and wants to focus on the leadership and how important they are to the people of Israel. We can also see this with the fact that it is set in Judah and stresses the southern kingdom of Judah, as the monarchy that descends from Solomon continues on in Jerusalem in the kingdom of Judah. The Elohist source focuses on the prophetic. This means that God often speaks in dreams and through prophets, such as Moses, in giving messages to people. The Deuteronomist source, much like the stress on the central shrine, focuses on fidelity to Jerusalem. This means not having shrines anywhere besides the city of Jerusalem. The priestly source focuses on the cultic, not in the sense that we think of cultic as a bad or made-up religion, but in the sense that the religion focuses on certain rituals and traditions that need to be carried out by priests in particular. God looks a little bit different in each source throughout the Torah. The J source shows an anthropomorphic God. Anthropomorphic means taking on or doing actions of humans. So we see God in the J source often smelling and thinking and feeling things that we don't see in the other sources. In this case, God is anthropomorphic, again, taking on human characteristics and performing human actions, even though he is not human in himself. The Elohist source focuses on a remote God. If you've heard of the clockmaker analogy, where God sets the world in motion and then steps back, this is much like we see it in the Elohist source. The Deuteronomist source does not focus as much on portraying God as it does on talking about what God has done in the world. Finally, the priestly source focuses on God as majestic. God in the priestly source is often incomprehensible and set apart from the world, not in the same sense as God is remote in the Elohist source, but in more of a majestic, kingly sense. Again, with this anthropomorphism, we see God walking and talking with humans, like we do in the Garden of Eden story. In the Elohist source, God speaks in dreams. In the Deuteronomist source, we see emphasis on morals. And again, in the priestly source, we see a cultic approach to God. The Israelites can approach God and get through to him and perform his will in the world by focusing on these rituals and traditions that have been passed down. The name used for God in these varies. In the Yahweh source, we see Yahweh, which we translate to Lord, used for God. Whereas in the Elohim source, we primarily see Elohim, which simply is translated to God. This happens up until about Exodus 3, when the divine name is revealed. So after this point, we can't rely just on the name of God to determine the source. The Deuteronomic source also uses Yahweh, whereas the priestly source uses Elohim. We see some minor differences, such as the fact that in the J source, Mount Sinai is the mountain where Moses receives the commandments, whereas Mount Horeb is where Moses receives the commandments in the E source. The Deuteronomic source is characterized by long sermons, again focusing on this moralistic approach, whereas the priestly source focuses on genealogies and lists. There are also covenants and laws focused on in the priestly source. Since the priestly source is focused on the cultic and how to get to God through rituals and traditions, we see these genealogies, these covenants and laws as a primary influence and of utmost importance in the priestly source. The J source is the fullest source in the Hebrew Bible. This is probably the first source, which we will look at in a moment, but is the one that we have the most of and provides most of the narrative from the Torah. The Elohim source is the most fragmentary. We only have bits and pieces of the source, and this is the one that when most scholars debate how many sources are in the Hebrew Bible, this is typically the one that gets cut out, as it is sometimes compiled with the J source. We find the J source in Genesis as well as through the rest of the Hebrew Bible, or throughout the rest of the Torah, but Genesis is the primary place that we see this source. The Elohim source makes up parts of Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers, whereas the Deuteronomic source, as you might be able to tell from the name, is found mostly in the book of Deuteronomy. Finally, the priestly source is found in Leviticus as almost a whole, but also frames the Torah. We find it in the beginning of Genesis, towards the end of Deuteronomy. The priestly source was probably the final source, and was probably the one who took the rest of the Torah and edited and compiled it. When we look at dating the sources, we have a few different years to focus on. The first source is probably the J source. It focuses primarily on the monarchy and stresses the southern kingdom of Judah. It was probably written around 950 BCE, which was around the time that Saul, David, and Solomon were king. We see the beginnings of the monarchy in this source, and it shows that kings have connection with an anthropomorphic God who interacts with them and cares about them. It stresses Judah and the leadership of Israel. So we see this as being the earliest source primarily because of these. The E source is probably the second source. This was written around 850 BCE and was probably written in the northern kingdom of Israel. This source would have been similar to what we see in the J source, but with a different focus on the northern kingdom of Israel rather than the southern kingdom of Judah. As we mentioned earlier, some of the themes that we see in the E source are dreams and prophecy being important to leadership and to being an everyday Israelite. And this is primarily because the kingship is not in Jerusalem for the northern kingdom of Israel, as it is for the southern kingdom of Judah, which the J source focuses on. Around 700, these sources were probably combined into one. 722 marks the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel, when many Jews fled from the northern kingdom to the southern kingdom of Judah. Around this time, these sources probably became compiled into one. In 630 BCE, we have the formation or the finding of the Deuteronomist source. According to the Book of Kings, King Josiah finds the Book of the Law, or Deuteronomy, in the temple when he's reforming it. Whatever the dating is for the source, a lot of it focuses on 630 BCE or thereabouts, and focuses on Jerusalem as the central shrine and the central place for the monarchy and for the religious institution of Israel as a whole. It also focuses on morals and sermons, which would have been important in reforming the Israelite religion. Finally, around 550 BCE, we have the P source. The P, or priestly source, is probably the last source, and is probably the redactor and compiler of the rest of the sources. 586 BCE marks the destruction of the southern kingdom of Judah and the beginning of the Babylonian exile. After this point, the Jews did not have a homeland or a temple, so much of how they interacted with God and with their religion was through the texts that they had recorded. It makes sense that the P source probably was written during this time, and probably took the other sources and compiled them into one, which we call the Torah, so that the Jews in exile would have some kind of hope for restoration. The P source, of course, focuses on the cultic. It focuses on how to perform rituals and live properly, and focuses on genealogies. These genealogies would have been important for Jews in exile to remember who their ancestors were, and also with the rituals, to explain to them how to live properly and to live for God in a post-exilic period. This dating system that we see for the documentary hypothesis is primarily for the Torah, though some scholars argue it extends into other books. In later videos, we'll talk about the Deuteronomist history, which focuses on extending the D source into Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. For this point, though, the dating of the sources primarily applies to the Torah. Let's take what we've talked about the documentary hypothesis and apply it to some texts in Genesis. You can pause the video at this point and read the text that's available on the screen. Let's talk about this text here. We can start off by looking at the writing style in the text. We see here that this text is much more poetic than we find in other places in the Hebrew Bible. There's not a clear chronology. There's no storyline that develops throughout the text. We simply see a deity, who here is referred to as God, or in the Hebrew, Elohim, who creates the world from speaking. God seems to be remote and removed from the world here. Later on in the story, God creates the world and creates animals, and then eventually creates humans. It says that male and female he created them. Let's switch to another story. This comes from Genesis 2, beginning in verse 4. Again, you can pause the video here to read through this before we talk about the text. In this passage, we see a few different things. First, we notice that the storyline is much more developed. This is something that develops over time and is not set in a poetic sense, but is more of a prose-like story. God makes the earth and notices that he can make something out of the dust of the ground that he's already created. He plants a garden. In this case, God is anthropomorphic, meaning that he does and has human characteristics. We see this name for God used, which is Lord. Again, in Hebrew, this is Yahweh. God makes man first, which we see here. And then God creates animals later in the story because he feels bad that his creation is alone. he eventually creates woman out of man's rib. There's no talk about a 7-day creation period, like we see in the previous story, or about the heavenly bodies. So what does this mean about the documentary hypothesis? We call these two stories that we've looked at the Genesis creation stories. As you might notice, there are two of them, and they're slightly different. As we noted when talking about the documentary hypothesis as a whole, these texts are parallel and tell similar stories, but with different characteristics, inconsistencies, and some repetitions. In this case, the first text that we saw focuses on God's creation by speaking. It's more poetic. It talks about a watery chaos before the world begins, and has an order of creation from animals to humans, with very little storyline and with God removed from the world. The second story that we looked at is more prose-like. Man is created first, then animals, and then woman. There's an arid landscape, more desert-like, from which God creates man, and there's no focus on 7 days and heavenly bodies. So take a moment and think of which sources from the documentary hypothesis these stories came from. If you guessed that 1:1 through 2:3 was from the priestly source, then you're correct. You can look back in the video, but we want to notice that the priestly source uses the name Elohim, or God, when referring to the deity, and focuses on ritual and cultic expectations for the Israelites. The 7-day creation period is set forth so that the Israelites remember to observe the Sabbath, which is on the 7th day, because God rested on that day. On the other hand, the second story is from the J, or Yahweh source. We see this in the fact that God walks and talks with humans. He feels for man after creating him, and therefore creates animals, and eventually woman, to be his helper. Later on in the book of Genesis, we'll see some various characteristics, primarily of the J source. The J source makes up most of Genesis 4 through 5, and is much of the rest of the book of Genesis. Some of the characteristics you'll see from the J source throughout the rest of Genesis include these three concerns. First, we see a deteriorating relationship between humanity and the earth. Humanity begins in the Garden of Eden, but eventually the relationship devolves. The flood comes, and humanity cannot live solely off the earth anymore, but build civilizations. We also see an emphasis on the separation of the divine from the human. This begins first off in the Garden of Eden, when God removes the humans from Eden. We also see this in the corruption of humanity throughout this text as well. This begins with Adam and Eve, but continues especially through Cain and Abel. When Cain kills his brother, and the first mention of sin in the book of Genesis, we see this progressive corruption of humanity. After watching this video, you should be able to explain the reason for the idea of the documentary hypothesis, particularly focusing on how Wellhausen came up with the idea. Identify the characteristics of the documentary hypothesis and the 4 sources. And apply the documentary hypothesis to various texts in the Torah, as we have with the Genesis creation stories.